Hello, students. Right now, we are going to look at the legal reasoning section. We'll go through the CLAT 2021 paper, the explanation for the official key, and identify if there are any issues that we have with the key. If there's anything that we want to object to, then I will be explaining those, and then you can take your call accordingly and raise objections if you are not satisfied and you want to contest the key. Okay, so firstly, before we get started, I'm sure that you would have seen the analysis yesterday. The legal reasoning has been an overall medium to difficult section. You might feel it's very easy because of a couple of reasons. The size of the passages has been small. The overall the familiarity with the topics are not something which you have not heard of, or normally what in CLAT 2020 you would have seen a lot of current affairs topics which have come as legal reasoning passages. But this year I think what they have done is most of the topics are, you had a couple of them which are related to the maxims, you had some on contracts. All those topics are familiar and you would have come across these questions multiple times. Some of these reasoning questions are, even you would have seen as principles and fact-based situations, you would have come across these kind of questions. So in that sense, these questions are not entirely new. And with that, you might feel that, it is very easy. Having said that, yes, definitely, you cannot call this the legal reasoning section as easy in any manner when you look at the questions and the options that are there and all those things. So totally there have been 40 questions, of which we have categorized 16 as easy, 18 medium, and 6 as difficult. So it is an overall a medium to difficult section, and a good score for those who've been aspiring to get into the top NLUs would be in the range of 27 to 30 is what we would expect you to get. So let's now look at each of these questions in detail and understand what would have been done, what would have been left, what's a question which and what are it's more so what is the rationale behind the different questions and the options. Let's look at the first passage now. I'm following the master question paper that has been released by the CLAT consortium late night of the day of the exam, that is 23rd. And the first, so because any objection that you raise, irrespective of what the question is in your own paper, you will need to still object to the question as per this paper. So while you are going through this, you might look at your responses, or you can look at the rationale from your paper which you have in front of you. But do understand that when you raise an objection, you have to do it with the question numbers as given in this paper that I am using right now. Okay, so let's get started. The first passage is on the principle or the maxim, the legal maxim of voluntas non fit injuria. That's a very familiar maxim that you have been exposed to. So harm suffered voluntarily does not constitute a legal injury and is not actionable. So basically, if you suffer harm voluntarily, then you can't say that your legal right has been violated, and so you cannot file a suit for compensation. So a person cannot complain of harm to the chances of which he has exposed himself with his free consent and free will. So the maxim voluntas non fit injuria is founded on good sense and justice. A person who has invited or assented to an act being done towards him. So if you agree to do an act, okay, when he suffers from it, he cannot complain that it is wrong, that he has been wronged, basically. So this maxim presupposes a tortious act by the defendant. When does this apply? When there is a tort case filed. This maxim applies to intentional acts which would otherwise be tortious. Now, though this is the normal case, there are some exceptions. So this passage mainly talks about the limitations to this maxim. It is no answer to a claim when you say it is no answer to a claim made by workman, this means that this defense cannot be used when a tortious claim has been made by a workman against his employer for injury caused through a breach by the employer of a duty imposed upon him by a statute. Basically, if a workman is working with the employer and an employer asks the employee to do something, and in that process, if he gets hurt, or if some damage is caused to him and he files a tortious claim on the employer, then the volenti non fit injuria cannot be available by the defendant, because it is a statutory duty, so he has to do it, he cannot refuse to do it. So where the negligence or breach of statutory duty is on the part of an employee of the plaintiff who knowingly accepts the risk flowing from such breach, and the employer defendant is not guilty of negligence or breach of statutory duty, then the defense of volenti non fit injuria is available to the defendant. So if it is part of the statutory duty that he is doing, then definitely you cannot use the defense of volenti non fit injuria. The employer will have to pay. Now, when is the second condition? Under an exigency caused by the defendant's wrongful misconduct and all these things, where the person endangered is one to whom he owes a duty of protection as a member of his family, or is a mere stranger to him to whom he owes no such special duty. The rescuer will not be deprived of his remedy merely because the risk which he runs is not the same as that run by the person whom he rescues. But where there is no need to take any risk, the person suffering harm in doing so cannot recover. Now, suppose somebody had to undergo some harm by taking some risk in order to save somebody, to rescue somebody, then obviously this defense cannot be used. But if there's no need to take a risk and somebody unnecessarily takes a risk and suffers harm in the process, then the person can clearly say that volenti non fit injuria, you took the risk and you have to suffer the consequences. I'm not going to pay you anything. Right? To cover a case of negligence, the defense on the basis of the maxim must be based on implied agreement, whether amounting to contract or not. The defense is available only when the plaintiff freely and voluntarily, with full knowledge of the nature and extent of the risk impliedly, agreed to incur it and to waive any claim for injury. So when this is this applies if somebody has, this defense can be used if the plaintiff fully knowing the nature and extent of the risk, one is knowing it, agrees to incur it and waive any claim for injury. In such a situation only this defense applies. But when the plaintiff has no choice, if there's no choice, or when the notice is given at the stage when it is beyond the ability of the plaintiff to make a choice, there can be no implied agreement and the defense on the basis of the maxim must fail. But if this person does not have a choice and he does that action, then he cannot use this defense of volenti non fit injuria, because he had to do it. Then it becomes the similar situation like the earlier. There's no other choice. He'll have to do it. He had to take that risk. Otherwise, something else would happen. So in that situation, this defense cannot be used. This maxim will also not apply when the act relied upon is done because of the psychological condition which the defendant's breach of duty has induced. I think this is not tested in the passage, so let's not worry about it. Let's look at the question, 626 question. A was the owner of a car and he had a driver, Mr. D. On Jan 19, 2021, Mr. A and Mr. D were traveling in their car, wherein Mr. A got down at the restaurant and told Mr. D to take the car back to Mr. A's bungalow. D was filling petrol tank of the car and two strangers, B and C, took a lift from D in his car. Now look at this. It is D's car. A is the, D is the driver of the car belonging to A, and B and C they took a lift from this guy. Note that this guy does not have an obligation to give a lift. So these people voluntarily came and took a lift from D. The car went ahead and the right side front wheel of the car flew away. The car toppled. D and C were thrown out. C sustained severe injuries, ultimately died due to those injuries. B and legal representatives of C claimed compensation from A and D. Now here the question is, will the compensation be applicable, or can they, use the defense of volenti non fit injuria? Now in this case, if you see, there was no obligation for, there was no reason for them to go. This car is not a taxi or something like that. So they have taken the risk on their own. They have voluntarily got into this, and whatever happens, they have to face the consequences. So in this case, the answer is clearly B, where the maxim will apply, volenti non fit injuria will be applicable, and no compensation can be claimed. Nobody forced them to get into this. They had other options, but they voluntarily came and took the lift in D's car. There's nothing information to tell that they were forced to get in or anything like that. So we have to assume that it is voluntary. Normally he was filling the petrol, and two strangers came and took a lift in his car. So in this case, they cannot claim any compensation. This is the official key, as well as Abhyas key is also the same thing, that option B, volenti non fit injuria, will be applicable. 67 is a straightforward question. We have seen this multiple times. Rama was a spectator at a motor car race being held on a track owned by the defendant company. During the race, there was a collision between two cars. One of the cars was thrown among the spectators, injuring Rama. Which of the following statements is correct? In this, very clearly, once you go into a motor car race, you cannot blame. Obviously, it will be volenti non fit injuria applies. The danger is inherent in the sport, so the defendant cannot be held liable for this. Option A, straightforward, official key, same as Abhyas key. Which of the following is correct? But about consent in volenti non fit injuria, we know that there are two aspects which is also mentioned in the passage, that knowledge has to be there, but knowledge alone is not enough. If you have seen that very clearly, that along with knowledge, he has to agree to incur it and to waive any claim or injury. So on this basis, we can clearly say that option A is the right answer, which is the same as the ALP key is the same as the official key here, right? 69. Lily had placed spring guns in a wood on her ground for the protection of the garden. Current, with full knowledge that there were spring guns somewhere in the wood, trespassed on the land of Lily and was injured. Which of the following statements is correct? Now, in this case, if Karan had no knowledge, then yes, he could, there would be some dispute. But in this case, he knows that there are spring guns. Still, he entered intentionally into somebody else's property. In fact, he even trespassed into somebody's property. In this case, we can clearly say that he had knowledge and he was willing to forego that. He waived the claim to injury. So D would be the answer in this case. And this is the same as what the official key also states, and which is the correct answer, that Karan had knowledge of the spring guns and willfully quoted the danger himself. The last question in this passage, which of the following is not an element to claim the defense of non fit injuria, volenti non fit injuria? Which of these is not required, is what, not an element is what you need to answer over here. If you see the options, prior knowledge is required, free consent is required, plaintiff is compelled to agree to a risk by the defendant, and voluntary acceptance is required. If he is compelled to agree, then this volenti non fit injuria cannot be used, right? He cannot use this defense. When plaintiff is compelled to agree to a risk by the defendant. So C is the answer in this case. The official key and the ALP key, both are the same. Okay. So straightforward, simple kind of a passage. The next one. This is about the giving the consent. How is it freely given or not? And more so whether it is fraud and misrepresentation have been discussed in detail over here. Let's see. For a contract, we need to have the party should agree to the same thing in the same sense. And mutual consent should also be free. It has to be understood in the same sense. Not only consent, but free consent is provided in section 10 in order to be, for it to be valid. And consent is free when it works without obstacles. When there is no consent or no real and certain object, there cannot be a contract. Okay. When the consent is not free, there is a contract voidable at the option of the party whose consent was not free. This is also not explicitly tested. Now, how do you know that the consent was not freely obtained? There has to be fraud, which includes, now what is fraud is given here: false assertion, active concealment, promise without intention of performing it, any other deceptive act, or any act declared as fraudulent. All these come under fraud. So in order to constitute fraud, the act should have been done by the party to the contract or by any other person with his connivance or by his agent. And what is the intention of fraud? To deceive the other party thereto or his agent, or to induce him to enter into the contract. So if you are getting somebody to enter into a contract with the intention to deceive that person, then it is a fraud. There's no duty upon parties to speak about facts likely to affect the other party's consent to the contract. So there's no duty that you have to say something for the other person to agree. And mere silence does not amount to fraud unless the circumstances of the case show that there is duty to speak, or silence is in itself equivalent to speech. Now, in general, if you are entering into a contract, there's no obligation for you to tell everything based on which the other person has to agree to the contract. You can remain silent unless he asks. But if you are asked something, then you have a duty to speak. And if you don't speak at that stage, somebody asks you, are there any faults? And you say that there are no faults, that means you're lying, that is a fraud. Or even if you remain silent at that stage, when you know that there are frauds, then also it is a fraud. Mere silence does not amount to fraud, but if you are asked that question, you have a duty to speak, and then in such a situation, silence can be treated as speech. And if you don't answer this, it is false speech, right? Now, the other aspect, what is misrepresentation? There are three categories. One, a statement of fact which, if false, would be misrepresentation if the maker believes it to be true. I am making a statement which I believe to be true, but which, if it is not justified by the information he possesses, okay, then it could be a misrepresentation. I believe that statement to be true, but in fact it is not true, then it is a misrepresentation. That is not fraud. If I know it is wrong and I'm saying it, then it is fraud. If I don't know but I make a statement, then it is called misrepresentation. Any breach of duty which gains an advantage to the person committing it by misleading another to his prejudice, thereby there being no intention. See, in misrepresentation, there's no intention to deceive, unlike fraud, which is deliberate misleading, and causing a party to an agreement to make a mistake as to the substance of the thing which is subject to the agreement, even though done innocently. Though you're doing innocently, if you're causing the party to make a mistake on the subject of the matter, substance of the agreement, then it would be a misrepresentation, which would then become voidable. Okay, let's look at the questions. Which of the following statements correctly depicts the essentials of misrepresentation? What all are given there? It is a positive statement of fact which is made or adopted by a party to a contract. So that means you're stating something and it is untrue. Okay, this definitely falls into it is a correct statement. Let's look at the others. Misrepresentation and false representation do not mean the same. Is it complete? It is not complete statement, right? Correctly depicts the essentials. What all is required? This is not answering that. If one party has induced the other to enter into a contract by misrepresenting, though innocently, any material fact, especially within his own knowledge, the party misled cannot avoid the contract. This is not the essentials of misrepresentation. Negative statement which is made or adopted by a party to a contract and is true. True statement cannot be a misrepresentation. So clearly there's only one answer, which is A. No confusion. Abhyas law prep answer and the official key both are same A. Let's look at the next one. So this description of fraud. This question talks about the description of fraud. Okay. The first statement is the expression fraud means an intention to deceive, whether it is from any expectation of advantage to the party himself or from ill will towards the other is immaterial. Yes. If there's an intention, whatever be the reason, it would become fraud. A fraud is an act of deliberate deception with the design of securing something by making an unfair advantage to another. It is a deception to gain from another's law. This is also a true statement. And fraud arises out of deliberate active role of the representator about a fact. This is also. So all three statements are correct statements. Just give me a minute. Okay, 72, no confusion. The official key and the ALP key both say it is C. Okay, let's look at the next question. Which of the following statements is correct? Fraud is an innocent, fraud is not innocent. It is a deliberate misrepresentation. So it cannot be innocent. The principal difference between fraud and misrepresentation is that in the former, the person making the suggestion does not believe it to be true. And in the latter, he believes it to be true. Now, in the case of fraud, this statement is a little convoluted, but it is a true statement and is the answer. In the latter, in misrepresentation, the person making the statements believes that it's a true statement. Whereas it is fraud when the person making that statement, he does not believe it to be true, which means he knows it is false and he still makes the statement. Just see how the statement is worded in a way as to confuse you. But what it essentially means is that in the case of fraud, the person who's making the statements knows it is a false statement. Whereas in the latter, in the case of misrepresentation, the person making the statement believes what he's saying is true. So the answer for this is option B. I think C and D are clearly incorrect. No confusion over here. Right. Question number 74. A sells a car to Y, his childhood friend, with the knowledge that the car is defective. Before buying the car, Mr. Y says to Mr. A, if you do not deny it, I shall assume that the car is perfect. A says nothing. Now here, he knows the car is defective, and when he asks, he remains silent. So in this case, this silence is equivalent to speech, and hence it is called a fraud. It is fraud and not misrepresentation, because he is intentionally hiding it. That's why it's called a fraud. Option D is the answer, and the official key and Abhyas answer both are the same. In which of the following statements will a contract not be voidable at the option of a contract of the party? So let's see in which cases it will not be voidable. Now, when it is consent is come by fraud, it can be voided. By misrepresentation, it can still be avoided. A contract entered by fraud and misrepresentation is neither void. This is not correct. When silence amount to fraud, but the other party whose consent was taken had discovered the truth or had the means of discovering the truth with ordinary diligence. Now, this person might be silent about something. Okay, you might think it is a fraud, but then you had your own means of discovering the truth, but you chose not to. You had the means, but you did not take your own precautions. You did not do your homework or your due diligence, and that is the reason why you did not know about it. Then you cannot go back and avoid the contract. It cannot be a voidable contract. So D is the answer over here, which is the correct answer. Okay. So yes, we have done two passages. Even this passage was a straightforward passage, not much. Only thing is you might have to spend a little time because all the answers are statements about inferences made in the passage rather than situations. So you had to go back and refer to the passage for the correct answers, and it could be a little time consuming. That is why some of these may not be considered very easy, though actually they're very easy, but because the options are closed, they become a little medium or difficult. Let's look at the next one. Section 4 of the Indian Contract Act. This is about the communication, about when it is when a contract is complete. Communication when complete. The communication of a proposal is complete when it comes to the knowledge of the person to whom it is made. The communication of an acceptance is complete as against the proposer when it is put in a course of transmission to him so as to be out of the power of the acceptor. So when the person is accepted and he doesn't have the power to take it back, at that stage, the communication is complete as against the proposer. That means the person who has received it. And as against the acceptor, it is complete when it comes to the knowledge of the proposer. Thus, the provision makes no difference in the position of the offerer. The offerer becomes bound when the properly addressed and adequately stamped letter of acceptance. The minute the acceptance is posted, the proposer or the one who's made the offer, he becomes bound, right? The acceptor does not become bound by merely posting. As soon as he posts his acceptance, he doesn't become bound. When does he become bound by the acceptance? When it comes to the knowledge of the proposer. The same thing has been explained in a little more detail over here. Now, this is an important statement. The contract is concluded at the place from where the proposal is accepted and communication of the acceptance is dispatched. That is the address at which the proposal was sent. Where are you sending the proposal? To the acceptor, right? Now, where is the contract concluded? At the place from where the proposal is accepted and the communication of the acceptance is discharged. So if A sends an offer to B and B accepts it, where B is accepting it, that is where the contract is concluded. And this is explicitly mentioned over here. The contract at the court at that place would have the jurisdiction to entertain a cause of action under the contract. This rule that the communication of an acceptance is complete as against the proposer when the letter is posted is probably, why is this there? When they're at a distance and the communication happens by post. For that purpose, we have this rule. Where, however, the parties are in each other's presence or though separated in space, they are in direct communication, as for example by telephone, no contract will arise until the offerer receives the notification of acceptance. Now, when it is in direct communication, that is almost instantaneous. So unless the person receives it, you don't say that it is complete. Let's look at the questions. S wanted to purchase shares of a company and communicated his offer to buy shares on March 1st. A letter of allotment of shares addressed to S, which is an acceptance of the offer to purchase shares, was posted by the company on March 10. But the letter never reached S and was lost in transit. In the given situation, which of the following statements is true? Now we saw very clearly that when is the acceptance for when the letter is posted, it is acceptance is complete against the offerer, right? And who's the offerer? S is the offerer at that stage. So acceptance is done by the company. So in this case, the communication of acceptance is completed as against X, however, not complete as against the company. Same, no confusion over here. Please note very carefully because there are some questions in this passage which are to be at least which in our opinion, Abhyas opinion, they are incorrect. Let's look at this question. 77A, who is in Mumbai. Now A is the offerer, he's in Mumbai, makes an offer for supply of goods to B, who is in Delhi. So the acceptor is in Delhi via a mobile phone call. During the same call, A's offer is absolutely and unconditionally accepted by B. So the acceptance is complete. According to the terms agreed between A and B, goods are to be supplied at Pune and payment is to be made electronically. In the given situation, where is the contract concluded? Offer is made from Mumbai and the acceptance happens in Delhi. So they are at a distance. However, the passage clearly says that the contract is concluded at the place from where the proposal is accepted and communication is dispatched. Now, in this case, they have mentioned that by telephone, no contract until the offerer receives the notification. Here, the receipt is also there. So if we go by the information given in the passage, the answer for this should be the place where the acceptance happened, and that is Delhi. This is the Abhyas answer. ALP answer is Delhi based on the information given in the passage. But the option given by the official answer given here is D. Now, if you have marked Delhi and if you believe that, if you also believe like us that this is the case, then you may object, contest the key for this particular question. Okay. So in this question, please note that when you do the objection, you have to use the question number as 77. If you have marked this answer, then you can object. Otherwise, I think there's no point in objecting to this, right? 78. Now, this is because the information is not explicitly given, but it can be inferred that way. Based on the information given in the passage, it can be inferred this way. There's no way that you can infer that it is Mumbai, because that's not mentioned anywhere. That the contract is concluded at the place where the offer was made. That is not mentioned in the passage at all. X, who is in Gandhinagar, makes an offer for sale of second-hand luxury car to Y, who is in Jammu, via an email sent on Jan 15 at 2:03 p.m. X offer is absolutely and unconditionally accepted by Y via an email sent on Jan 15 at 4:04 p.m. The email communicating acceptance is read by X on Jan 15 at 7:05. When is the contract concluded? We saw that. When is it concluded? It's concluded as against Y when X, sorry. Yeah, it's concluded. Acceptance is done by Y. So X's acceptance is completed when it is sent, and Y's acceptance when it is received, right? So A is the answer. No confusion over here. The ALP answer and is the same as the official answer. 79 again is very similar to 77. Over here also, if you see, X, who is in Agra, makes an offer for sale of second-hand luxury car to Y, who is in Jammu, via an email sent on Jan 15 at 2:03 p.m. However, the email did not reach Y due to some technical error at the server, which is located in Delhi. Thereafter, X makes a mobile phone call to Y at 4:04 p.m. and makes him the same offer as was made in the email. In the same mobile phone call, the offer is absolutely and unconditionally accepted by Y. In the given situation, where is the contract concluded? Based on the information given in the passage, it should be at the position, at the location of the acceptor, who is in Jammu. So the ALP answer is B, Jammu, and the however, the official answer is given as C, which is Agra, at the place at which the offer has been issued. Now, if you wish, you may contest this question also. 79, 77 and 79, the logic being the same. You can contest. If you have marked B as the answer, you can go ahead and contest. Next question, when the words of acceptance are spoken into the telephone, they are put into the course of transmission to the offerer so as to be beyond the power of the acceptor. The acceptor cannot recall them. In light of the given proposition, Which of the following statements are true? Let's look at that. The communication being instantaneous, the contract immediately arises. So in the case of, if it is beyond the power of the acceptor, then you cannot recall it. You say something, you cannot take it back, right? So as soon as you say it, the contract immediately arises. True statement. The communication being instantaneous, communication of acceptance is immediately complete as against the proposer as well as the acceptor. Yes, this is a another way of stating the same statement. So both are true. This says it is non-instantaneous, non-instantaneous. So these two are definitely false. B is your answer. Yes, official key and Abhyas ALP key, both are the same. Right? So this passage, though it appears easy, yes, the questions are straightforward. However, there is some confusion with the key. Let's look at the next passage. This is about the restraint of legal proceedings. Parties cannot, by contract, exclude the jurisdiction of all courts. You can't say that there cannot be any remedy available to you if there's a breach of contract. Such a contract would constitute an agreement in restraint of legal proceedings, and it goes against, goes against Section 28 of the Indian Contract Act 1872. Now, when parties to a contract confer jurisdiction on one amongst multiple courts having proper jurisdiction. Now, in the contract, you can specify or confer jurisdiction on one amongst multiple courts having proper jurisdiction. You cannot give it, you can say that, okay, there are 2 or 3 valid jurisdictions. Let us say that, you can only file a case in this particular court. That is possible. In such a situation, you do not say that this you have ousted the jurisdiction of all courts. It is not like that. Such a contract is valid and it will bind the parties to civil action. Let's understand what is Section 28. Every agreement by which, in which case agreements in restraint of legal proceedings are void, in which case every agreement by which any party thereto is restricted absolutely from enforcing his rights under or in respect of any contract by the usual legal proceedings in the ordinary tribunals, or which limits the time within which he may thus enforce his rights. If you're saying that, you're giving limited time, or you're restricting the time within which you can file a case, then it is not, it becomes a void. That particular clause or agreement becomes void. The next condition is which extinguishes the rights of any party thereto or discharges any party thereto from any liability under or in respect of any contract on the expiry of a specific period so as to restrict any party from enforcing his rights is void to that extent. Okay. So if you say that you cannot, after a certain period you cannot, then you are restricting and it will be void to that extent. Parties cannot be, by agreement, confer jurisdiction on a court which lacks the jurisdiction to adjudicate. If a court does not have the jurisdiction, you cannot say that you have an agreement and say that you can go to that court. It's not possible. But if several courts have jurisdiction, then they can stipulate that you can only go to this court and not the other courts. That kind of thing is possible, right? So let's look at the questions. A resident of Mumbai and B, a resident of Delhi, enter into a contract or an agreement for sale and supply of goods. The transaction takes place partly in Mumbai and partly in Delhi. There is a clause in the agreement which stipulates that in the event of a dispute between A and B, the courts in Kolkata would have exclusive jurisdiction to decide the dispute. A and B agreed to the said clause. So Mumbai and Delhi, and they are saying that they will have this case in Kolkata. Now, is this valid? Definitely, this will be in restraint of legal proceedings. Why? Because the court does not have jurisdiction. Okay, this does not have a jurisdiction at all. So no confusion, no objection. Answer official key is A. ALP key is also A. 82. A resident of Chennai and B, a resident of Bangalore, enter into an agreement for sale and supply of goods. The transaction takes place partly in Chennai and partly in Bangalore. There's a clause in the agreement which stipulates that in the event of a dispute between A and B, the courts in Chennai would have exclusive jurisdiction to decide the dispute. A and B agreed to the said clause in order to avoid dispute over choice between the two proper places, Chennai and Bangalore. In this context, what happens? Yes, this is a valid one because Chennai has the jurisdiction. Unlike the earlier case where did not have the jurisdiction. So D, correct answer, and official key is also D, no issues. 83. A resident of Agra and B a resident of Bhubaneswar enter into an agreement for sale and supply of goods. Transaction takes place partly in Agra and partly in Bhubaneswar. There is a clause in the agreement which stipulates that in the event of a dispute between A and B, neither of them can approach the court of law or take recourse to any alternative dispute resolution mechanism to settle the dispute. In this case, what happens? You can't go to any court or to any alternative ADR solution. So in this case, you're restricting the legal proceedings. So the answer will be A, no confusion over here, straightforward question. Okay, 84A, a resident of Ahmedabad and B, a resident of Ranchi enter into an agreement for sale and supply of goods. The transaction takes place partly in Ahmedabad and partly in Ranchi. Clause 6 of the agreement stipulates that in the event of a dispute arising between them, within 6 months of entering the contract, so the time restriction, they can approach a court in either Ahmedabad or Ranchi, both are proper places, or take recourse to any ADR mechanism. And clause 7 states that if there is a dispute between A and B, after 6 months, they have to the courts in Chennai. But you see, Ahmedabad, Ranchi. So Chennai does not have jurisdiction at all. So clause 7 is ruled out. And here there is a restriction within 6 months. So both 6 and 7 are not, they become void. Both these clauses are become irrelevant because you are restricting them from going ahead for any legal proceedings. D is the correct answer, Abhyas answer as well as the official key is also D. Now, which of these is a true statement? Cannot make a choice? They can. But they cannot, by contract, exclude the jurisdiction of all courts. This is a true statement. Any court? No. They can only do it on one which is a valid jurisdiction. Extinguished by their rights, they cannot give up their rights. So these are also wrong. Official key same, Abhyas key same. Answer is B. Let's now look at the next passage. This is the doctrine of re judicata. This is again another legal maxim. If you see, there are multiple passages on contracts and there are multiple passages on maxims. We already saw there was one on volenti non fit injuria, and now we are seeing the other one on doctrine of re judicata. Requires that a party should not be allowed to file same matter repeatedly against the other party, either in the same court or in other competent court. And the decision given by one court should be accepted as final subject to any appeal, revision or review. We know this, that if you are not happy with the court, you can appeal, but you cannot file another case. And what is the principle behind doing that? It is in the interest of the public at large that a finality should be attached to the binding decisions pronounced by courts of competent jurisdiction. It is also in the public interest. Individuals should not be vexed. You can't harass people with the same kind of litigation. Apart from this, it is to ensure that ultimately there should be an end to litigation. So these are the reasons why you have this doctrine in place. This is embodied in section 11 of Code of Civil Procedure, and it is up. Now, section 11 is inapplicable to writ jurisdiction. Supreme Court has observed that though this rule is technical in nature, yet the general doctrine of re judicata is based on public policy. Therefore, it cannot be treated as irrelevant or inadmissible. even in dealing with fundamental rights in petitions filed under Article 32 of the Constitution of India. The court observed that if a writ petition filed by a party under Article 226 of the Constitution of India is considered on merits as a contested matter and is dismissed, the decision thus pronounced would continue to bind the parties unless it is otherwise modified or reversed in appeal or other appropriate proceedings permissible under the Constitution of India. That means if you file a writ petition under Article 226, writ petition under Article 226 with the High Court, the court sees the merits. That means they go through the case and then they dismiss it because it doesn't hold good, it doesn't stand. In that case, this decision would be binding, just like just like any other case which is judged. Re judicata will apply here also. It would not be open to a party to ignore the judgment of the High Court and move Supreme Court under Article 32. You cannot file an independent writ petition under Article 32. You can appeal this decision. You can go for the same thing, but you cannot file a fresh case under Article 32. The Supreme Court would then say it has already been judged, re judicata applies. Okay. But if the petition filed in the High Court under Article 226 is dismissed, but not on the merits, that means not on some technical matter, on the way it has been filed or something like that, in that kind of a situation, the dismissal of the writ petition would not constitute a bar to a subsequent petition under Article 32. However, if the petition is dismissed without passing a speaking order, then such dismissal can be treated as creating a bar of re judicata. So if the dismissal is not because of the merits, but for some other reason, then it would not be a case of re judicata. You can directly go to Supreme Court with using writ 32. Okay, let's look at the questions. Which of the following is re judicata applicable to? It applies to both civil suits as well as writ petitions, both A and B. Now, interestingly, across the entire paper, the official paper, and I have looked at some other paper also from one of the students, and what I have noticed is that this particular question, the options in all the other questions, the same options have been used everywhere, A, B, C, D. But in this particular question, these two have been reversed in some of the other paper. So in case you have this kind of a situation, please be careful. The answer for this is both A and B. And if the option for this that you have got is C, both A and B comes as C, then you may want to contest this question, raise an objection for this so that your answer is properly considered. Okay. Otherwise, you don't need to worry about it. The answer is not wrong. Both A and B is the answer, but only thing is that this came as option C in some of the papers. If that happens, you may want to, give it, ask for and you have marked that as the answer. Then you may want to, object to it or put in your request for consideration. 87, doctrine of re judicata is applicable if this applies if it's the order, again in this case, the re judicata applies to writs in case the case is considered on the merits and if the order is a speaking order. So C is the right answer. This is the same as the official key is also the same, Abhyas key is also the same. No question about, no confusion here. There is no, objection. On which of the following is the doctrine of re judicata based? I think all these have been mentioned. We have seen that nobody should be vexed twice. Finality should be reached. There should be an end to litigation. All these 3 points have been mentioned. That's why it is all of these, the same as the official answer. Which of the following is correct? Now, I think the proper explanation, technical, let's see. If a writ petition is filed under Article 226, and the same is rejected on merits by a speaking order, then it is barred by re judicata. We've discussed this just now. So this is a true statement. The doctrine of res judicata is founded on the principle that it is in the interest of public at large that a finality should be attached. This is also a true statement. Technical rule of res judicata only prevents multiple filing of petitions under Article 226 between same parties over the same and is not applicable to petition under Article 32 of the Constitution of India. No, doesn't mean that res judicata means that you can, it is only about for the same court and not for Article 32. No, res judicata, if it is rejected on the merits of the case, then you cannot go with Article 32 also. You cannot file in the Supreme Court, not just the High Court, even the Supreme Court you cannot file. So this is statement is wrong. So answer for this is D. Both A and B are true statements. No confusion. Abhyas key is same as the official key. Question number 90. X was dismissed from service by his employer after proper inquiry. X challenged his dismissal in High Court by a petition under Article 226 of the Constitution. However, court dismissed his petition that X has an alternative remedy available. X took recourse to alternative remedy before the appropriate forum, but X legal action was opposed by the employer on the basis of res judicata. Now, in this case, it was dismissed saying that it has an alternative remedy. So it's not because of the merits of the case. They just tell you go and do this. So definitely res judicata does not apply. Okay. So now let's look at the next passage. This is about compassionate appointment. This is like, somebody dies in duty and you want to compensate that person by giving employment to the kith and kin of that person. Compassionate appointment is an exception to the general rule of appointment, which is a way of providing employment to the family of the deceased employee on compassionate grounds. So here you might have some exceptions to the general rules of appointment. You might bypass some rules of the appointment because you want to provide employment to the family of a deceased employee on compassionate grounds. The objective is to provide solace and succor to the family in difficult times, and thus its relevancy is at that stage of time when the employee passes away. Now, giving compassionate employment is relevant when this happens, when the person dies. That is the time when it is required. The mere death of an employee in harness does not entitle his family to such source of livelihood. The authority concerned has to examine the financial condition of the family of the deceased, and it is only if it is satisfied that but for the provision of employment, the family will not be able to meet the crisis that the job is offered to the eligible member of the family. It is not a matter of right. Only if it is decided by the court or the concerned authorities that this person, because of this person has died and he is, the salary of that person to the family is immediately cut off, they will not be able to support themselves, and that there is a need. That is the reason why somebody from the family will be given a job. It was further asseverated in the said state judgment that compassionate employment cannot be granted after a lapse of a reasonable period, as the consideration of such employment is not a vested right which can be exercised at any time in the future. Now, when something is a right, it is always a right. But this is not a right kind of thing. It is done out of compassion. So it only applicable at that time when the employee passes away, not at a future point of time. That's what the Supreme Court also has said. Further, it has held that the object of compassionate employment is to enable the family to get over the financial crisis that it faces at the time of death of the sole breadwinner. Thus, compassionate appointment cannot be claimed or offered after significant lapse of time after the crisis is over. After a long gap is there, then there's no meaning in giving employment at that stage because the crisis part is over. They don't have that type of a need. So let's look at the questions. Which of the following correctly states the intent behind the application of compassionate? So the norms at the time of death of the government employee will be applicable and not the norms at the time of making an application. It's not relevant. The intention is not that. Dependent of a government employee cannot demand consideration of his or her, no, not a true statement. The norms of the government or public authorities are not considered while applying. It's not like that. The norms prevailing on the date of consideration of the application should be the basis for consideration of claim for compassionate. So on what basis they will do? It will be what are the norms available at the time of the application, not at the time of the death. Okay, that's what is the answer or the explanation given here. So in this case, the answer for this is option D, which we are in agreement with. Which of the following is not correct about the rule of compassionate appointment? It's given to families irrespective. No, if they don't deserve it, they will not be given. It is to mitigate the hardship is a true statement. It is not a matter of vested right, true statement. Absence of rules and regulation issued. If there are no rules made, then it cannot be done. That is also a true statement. So A is the answer, which is not true. Official key, Abhyas key, same. 93. Why son of X made a representation before ABC government company on Jan 4 that he should be given appointment on compassionate grounds as his father died during his employment in the company in 2000. Now 2000 he died, 2018 he's asking. So will he get or not? Definitely he cannot be getting it because long period has elapsed. This is the reason. It's not because of discretion but because of the period. So B is the answer. 94. Sorry. The government of N formulated a scheme for providing compassionate appointment to dependents of government servants who retired on medical invalidation. Just give me a minute. Sorry about that. Okay. The government of N formulated a scheme for providing compassionate appointment to the dependents of government servants who retired on medical invalidation by a further notification. The benefit of this scheme was restricted to cases where the government servants retired on medical invalidation at least 5 years before attaining the age of superannuation. Consider the given facts and decide which of the following is correct in relation to the validity of this rule. Now, it is very clearly given that the government can define the rules for this. So, based on that, D is the answer. Correct option is D and the same as the official answer. Which of the following is not correct regarding the nature of appointment? Let's see this. A request for compassionate appointment by the dependent relatives must be preferred without any undue delay. True, it has to be done immediately. General rule of appointment is not always applicable. This is also true. First statement says that clearly. The immediacy of the need is not the basis for the state to allow the benefit. Now, clearly, the immediacy of the need is the reason. So, definitely, this is a wrong statement. So, this is not correct. Benefit given, this is a true statement. So, C is the answer. No objection. Okay. So, this was a very small passage, short passage. Maybe the content of the passage may not have been familiar with earlier, but the passage itself is small. Yes, the options might take a little time to understand and do it, but definitely not a difficult kind of thing to attempt. Okay, let's see this. Marriage is necessarily the basis of social organization. Now, this talks about bigamy and the validity of a marriage and all that. So, marriage is necessarily the basis of social organization and the foundation of important legal rights and obligations. The importance and imperative character of the institution of marriage needs no comment. Okay, in Hindu law, marriage is treated as samskara or a sacrament. Hindu Marriage Act introduced monogamy as a law of marriage among Hindus by virtue of Section 5. So in 1955 of the Hindu Marriage Act, this was introduced. Monogamy was introduced as a law of marriage. Essentially, the voluntary union of life of one man with one woman to the exclusion of all others. That means monogamy means one man, one wife. That's it. Neither party must have a spouse living at the time of marriage. So when two people are getting married, neither of them should have a living spouse. Spouse means lawfully married husband or wife. Please note, doesn't mean girlfriend or something, only husband or wife. Before a valid marriage can be solemnized, both parties to such marriage must be either single or divorced or a widow or a widower. So that means in the past they could have been married, but that marriage should no longer be valid today at the time of the marriage. Both parties to such marriage must be either single, okay, and only then they are competent to enter into a valid marriage. Now, if at the time of performance of the marriage rites and ceremonies, one or other of the parties had a spouse living and the earlier marriage had not already been set aside, the later marriage is no marriage at all. So, if one of them has a spouse, then the marriage that is performed cannot be considered as a marriage at all. The Supreme Court in Bhaurao Shankar Lokhande versus State of Maharashtra held, prima facie the expression whoever marries in section 494 of the IPC 1860, which defines the offense of bigamy, must mean whoever marries validly. Both marriages have to be valid, or whoever marries and whose marriage is a valid one. If marriage is not valid according to the law applicable to the parties, no question arises of its being void by reason of its taking place during the life of the husband or wife of the person married. So if the earlier marriage was not valid, then this becoming void does not arise at all. One of the conditions of a valid marriage in the Hindu Marriage Act is that it must be solemnized. So for a marriage to be valid, it has to be solemnized. What does that mean? Further, provides for grounds of divorce to wife and states a wife may also present a petition for the dissolution of her marriage by a decree of divorce on the ground that in the case of any marriage solemnized before the commencement of this act, that the husband had married again before such commencement, or that any other wife of the husband married before such a commencement was alive at the time of the solemnization of the marriage of the petitioner, provided that in either case the other wife is alive at the time of the presentation of the petition. Even when you are, by the time of the petition also, the other wife has to be alive, not just at the time of the marriage, even while filing the petition. But of course, this is not being tested, so don't worry about it too much. Let's look at the questions. 96. A 40-year-old male Hindu was married to Miss B, a 36-year-old female Hindu. Mr. A fell in love with his colleague, C, a 22-year-old female Christian. On April 8th, A declared C as his wife in front of all his colleagues, family members and relatives. Based on the given facts, decide the liability of A as per Hindu law. Now in this case, A is married to B. He introduces C as this thing. Has he solemnized his marriage with C? That's not given there at all. So can he be said that he is liable for the offense? Because he has not solemnized the marriage with C. Marriage with A is a valid one, but marriage with C is not indicated anywhere. So we don't know that he has been actually married with C. He's only introduced C as his wife. So he cannot be liable for bigamy for that purpose. C is the answer. Had he married C, then it would have been liable for the offense of bigamy. But he has not married. He's only introduced her as his wife. Which of the following statements correctly expresses the interpretation of the word solemnize under Hindu law? I think it's given very clearly in the passage itself that it means celebrating the marriage with proper customary rites and ceremonies of either party to a marriage. 98. Which of the following is not correct regarding the law of monogamy among Hindus? Now, this is another interesting question here. This is a true statement. Monogamy is a union of man and woman. Monogamy as a law was abolished after 55. Yes, because monogamy was introduced in 55 as a law. So this definitely is a false statement. The second marriage during the subsistence of a valid first marriage is void. This is also a true statement, no doubts. If a husband solemnizes a second marriage during the subsistence of first marriage, it is not an offense. However, it is an offense if the wife commits the same act. Now this, in both cases, it is an offense. So this is also correct. The official key is given as B, but Abhyas ALP, we feel that both B and D are correct answers. So that's our explanation for this. So in case you have not marked B, but you have marked D as an answer, you may want to contest that both are the correct answers. So they can take the decision accordingly if they want to give both as correct answers. Okay. So this is 98 is one question which you can, if you have marked D as an answer, then you can also, ask that it is correct. But B is definitely right. There's no question about it. 99. On the basis of section 13 of the Hindu Marriage Act, which of the following statements does not relate to the remedy? Here, I think the object of the section was to provide opportunity to the wife. Yes. The introduction of his ground of divorce is unnecessary as it disturbs. This is a completely irrelevant statement. So you can go with B as the right answer. 100th question. P, a 28-year-old male Hindu, was legally married to Q, a 26-year-old female Hindu. P converts to Islam to marry N, a 30-year-old Sunni female Muslim. Consider the statement, decide whether Q has a remedy to file a complaint for offense of. See, at the time that they were valid, there was a valid marriage between P and Q, and he was Hindu, Q is also Hindu. So definitely she can file a complaint for the offense of bigamy against the Hindu law. So these are a little, maybe not entirely given. The other options are not valid. So we can go with D, definitely. Let's look at the last passage. The Indian Penal Code does not define consent in positive terms, but what cannot be regarded as consent under the code is explained in section 90. Now, what does section 90 state? Consent known to be given under fear or misconception. A consent is not such a consent as is intended by any section of this code if the consent is given by a person under fear of injury or under a misconception of fact. Two factors, under fear of injury or under misconception of fact. Then it is not called a consent. And if the person doing the act knows or has reason to believe that the consent was given in consequence of such fear or myth. Now, the person who has got the consent or who has made the other person give the consent knows that this person is giving in under fear or injury or under misconception, then it is not a free consent. Consent given firstly under fear of injury and secondly under a misconception is not consent at all. That is what is enjoined by the first part of section 90. These two grounds specified are analogous to coercion and mistake of fact, which are the familiar grounds that can vitiate a transaction under the jurisprudence of our country as well as other countries. So basically, the fear of injury is similar to coercion, and the misconception of fact is the same as mistake of fact. The factors set out in the first part of section 90 are from the point of view of the victim, the one who has given the consent. And the second part of section 90 enacts the corresponding provision from the point of view of the accused to whom the consent was given. It envisages that the accused too has knowledge or has reason to believe that the consent was given by the victim in consequence of fear of injury or misconception of fact. So the second part lays emphasis on the knowledge or reasonable belief of the person who obtains the tainted consent. So consent, we are not saying it is free if the person who's giving the consent is under the fear of injury or having a misconception of fact. The second part says that the person who got the consent also is aware that the person is giving the consent under the fear of injury or misconception. Both have to be cumulatively satisfied. In other words, the court has to see whether the person giving the consent had given it under fear of injury or misconception, and the court should also be satisfied that the person doing the act, that is making them give the consent, is conscious of the fact or should have reason to think that but for the fear of or misconception, the consent would not have been given. Now, this person should know that if that person was not under the fear or did not have this misconception, they would not have given the consent. In such a condition, this consent is not valid. This is the scheme of section 90, which is couched in negative terminology. This entire section 90 is not talking about what is consent. It is only telling what is not consent. This cannot be construed as an exhaustive definition of consent for the purposes of IPC. So you can't say completely what all is consent. What is given is non-exhaustive. The normal connotation and concept of consent is not intended to be excluded. Various decisions of High Court and Supreme Court have not merely gone by the language of section 90, but traveled a wider field guided by the etymology of the word consent. So the word consent itself is quite exhaustive. So you're not going, the section is not going into those details, but only what is not consent have been explicitly mentioned over there. A man promises B, a woman, that he will marry her if she has sexual intercourse with him. B agrees, but after having the intercourse, A flees and never contacts B again. In this situation, which statement is true? This consent was given under what? Is there a fear of injury? No, that he will marry, right? So it's a misconception of fact. And this guy never had the intention to, that's why he flew. He went away. So A is the answer. No contradiction over here. Abhyas key and the official key are both A. 102. According to the given passage, a person is said to consent to the doing if a person agrees to do an act without misconception of fact or fear of injury. A person to whom agreement is signified has no reason to believe that it was given under misconception of fact or fear of injury. Now we know that both parts, even the one who's to whom the agreement is signified and the one who is giving, both, this person agrees to do, and the person to whom he is signified that they have no reason to believe that it is under that. Only then it is valid. According to your understanding of the given passage, why is negative terminology used? Negative terminology is used because they want to emphasize that on the non-exhaustive scope of definition of consent. They don't want to restrict it. They want to make it D is the answer. None of the others make sense. 104. X, a man promises Y that they will marry, and then Y agrees, they have intercourse, and then after that X assures Y that they'll get married, but X's family is opposed. Now X believed that he did not have any intention to deceive or misconception at that stage. X's family is not this thing. So the consent was given without misconception of fact or fear of injury in this case. Misconception is if this guy knows that he will not marry. Here he didn't know that. So it's not a misconception of fact given. According to the passage, which of the following statements is not true? Misconception vitiates consent, yes. Fear of injury will do, yes. Misconception of fact obviates the necessity. Obviates means takes away the necessity of consent. Obviously not. So this is a wrong statement. Fear of injury is the same as coercion is also true. So C is the answer clearly with elimination. Even if you don't understand entirely, you can mark this option as C. Straightforward. Okay. So I hope you're clear. We saw that question 77 and question 79. There is difference in understanding, and you can raise objections. 86, we saw that there was a change in options were a little interchanged, and in 98 we saw that there are two answers. Beyond that, I think there have been no errata in the key. All the other questions are absolutely fine, and I hope you have understood the explanations for all the questions. All the best. I'm hoping that you're all, most of you are able to achieve the, the institute of your choice. All the best.